Over the years, the UFC has had its fair share of commentators of varying styles and personalities, and in this video, I want to rank every single commentator the UFC has had in the form of a tier list. Hopefully, I didn't miss anybody, though I do believe I got them all. Now, obviously, this list is almost completely subjective, as it just boils down to what you like listening to, which is going to be different for almost everybody. So to keep it somewhat objective, I'll be using things like preparedness and knowledge to help me rank. So even if I don't necessarily enjoy listening to a particular commentator, but I think that they do a good job, or at the very least put in a lot of effort to their job, I might rank them a little bit higher than if I was ranking them solely based off of who I would rather listen to. But obviously, like every tier list, if you disagree with any of my opinions, even though my opinions are literally the best opinions of all time, let me know down in the comments below. I read pretty much every single comment. Please like the video if you would be so kind. I would greatly appreciate it. Now let's get into it. We're going to start in D tier, work our way up, and I will save both F and S tier for last. Now, the first commentator to get ranked on this tier list going into D tier is going to be Dominick Cruz. I think there are so many examples of Dominick Cruz being a not so great commentator. The glaring obvious example would be him in the Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov fight. Everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. Him talking as if Conor McGregor is trying to gas out Khabib Nurmagomedov so he can turn it on in the later rounds, I guess, because that's totally been a strategy that Conor McGregor has implemented in the past, as if he has a magnificent gas tank that just never ends. You know, it was very strange. There was multiple things he said throughout the course of that fight, though. You could, I mean, if you almost jump to any point in that fight, he's probably saying something stupid. But for me, it's the constant bringing up of the Keith Peterson situation. But what drives me the most crazy about it is Dominick Cruz doesn't even come direct. They're mostly sneak disses that he is levying towards Keith Peterson. And I understand that lately, or recently, Keith Peterson has made some mistakes that might make Dom Cruz look like he was correct the whole time, but he wasn't, dude. He just got lucky that Keith Peterson eventually started to mess up consistently, right? Like a broken clock is right twice a day type thing. Also, he will compare that situation of him getting stopped versus Henry Cejudo to situations that are not even remotely fucking similar. Okay, in the trilogy fight, Stipe Miocic versus Daniel Cormier, at the end of round 2, Stipe Miocic knocked down Daniel Cormier, and DC sat down on his butt, back up against the cage. Stipe climbed into his lap like he was visiting Santa Claus at the fucking mall or something, and tried to finish him, but it wasn't really ever close to being stopped. Stipe wasn't able to land up very good follow-up shots. Daniel was doing a good job at defending himself, and Stipe was trying to like go in around his arm to just land little tiny pop shots. And of course, when the bell rings for that round to end, Dominick Cruz has to throw in the, wow, good job on the referee for allowing him to try and survive. Good job, ref. And he says it all insecurely, like he gets quieter as his sentence goes on, like as if he's just hesitant. He's insecure about what he's saying. He's like, as if Tone Loc was a commentator, that's Dominick Cruz. He's also got this like weird awkward stutter or something, you know. But to go back to that, Dominick Cruz just wants referees to treat him and others, I guess, like zombies. I can't think of a single time I've heard Dominick Cruz criticize a late stoppage. But like, dude, not every situation is even remotely close to yours. Like, hey, do you understand? I don't fucking get it. Like I said, awkward stutter or something like that. He's just not all that great at speaking unless he's trash talking a much dumber Cody Garbrandt. It's just really rough to listen to for me. And also, he can be one of the most like condescending little dicks of all time. But maybe at the Choice Center, they just don't teach you to be kind to others or something. I have no idea what they teach them there, but it sure as fuck is not how to do a good job commentating a fight. Okay, moving on to the next commentator to get ranked on this tier list going into D tier is gonna be John Gooden. Now, I would imagine some Brits are upset by this decision, but you know what, dude? He woke up and chose violence, bro. Shut up. It is the cringiest fucking thing to me. He says it, it's like he's trying to make it his catchphrase. He wants to be famous in 30 years for saying he woke up and chose violence with his little bow tie and shit. You know, I don't know if John Gooden is a Game of Thrones fan rather, but to me, it just seems like he's trying to be cool and act like Cersei when she said that one time to her little cousin or whatever it was, Lancel, when she had the mountain. You know what I'm talking about? Although, even though she's a woman and she had very short hair at that time and all she sounded cooler saying it than this guy did. Okay? Now, listen. He is pretty goddamn knowledgeable, at least in terms of grappling, and I'm sure he's a nice guy. But I'll tell you what. When I'm watching fights, I don't want to feel like I'm watching soccer or football, whatever the fuck you guys call it, okay? I don't want to hear it. John Gooden sounds like he should be commentating a soccer match or game or whatever you call it and yelling out things like brilliant when they kick a ball, you know? So, like I said, sure, he's a nice guy, knowledgeable, at least in terms of jiu-jitsu and all the rest of it, and he definitely enjoys the sport. But for me, dude, I don't like listening to him. Let's move on to the next commentator to get ranked into D tier, and that's going to be Jim Brown. Now, Jim Brown was a former professional football player, played for the Cleveland Browns, and he commentated very early on for the UFC. I think just over 1 year. In 1993, maybe not even for 1 year, maybe just the year of 1993. I believe he was there for UFC 1, and he actually gave Dan Severn his nickname, The Beast. Now, I do think it's cool, especially at the time, of a celebrity to come and help out a company like the UFC, not knowing a whole lot about the sport or anything like that, especially that early on when the UFC was very taboo, and people were still talking about it like it was human cockfighting and all the rest of it. But, you know, it's not like... To be fair, a lot of the guys early on didn't really know what the fuck they were watching. And who knows, dude, maybe had they allowed women to compete against men in the early days, maybe Jim Brown would have gotten much more into the sport and been a very successful commentator / fighter. But he wasn't around for a whole lot, and he was probably just there for name value. So that's why he's in D tier. But either way, let's move on to the next commentator to get put into that D tier spot. And this is going to be Jeff Blatnick. You know, some young fans probably have no idea who these last two guys are, and that's okay. Jeff Blatnick did help the UFC quite a bit in the early days. He was the commissioner in 1999. But to be fair, like I said, when it came to Jim Brown, a lot of people didn't know what they were watching, even the commentators back then. Obviously, Blatnick knew a lot about wrestling. He was an Olympic gold medalist after he had cancer, too, which is pretty fucking wild, to put it mildly, honestly. But when it came to other disciplines, he didn't know all that much. Multiple times I've heard him refer to triangle chokes as neck cranks and just little things like that. So that's, you know, part of the reason he's in here. When Zuffa came along, he kind of got forced out of the role he was currently doing, which was the commissioner role at that time. So who knows? Maybe had he gotten to stick around a little bit longer, kind of like Jim Brown, maybe he would have started to pick more things up. And to be fair, if you listen to his very early commentary and compare it to, you know, towards the end of his commentary job, he definitely had learned quite a bit. It seemed like he was actively trying to pursue knowledge about the sport and things like that, which I do appreciate, but he just wasn't around for long enough. And, you know, like I said, to be fair to these early guys, most of them didn't know what they were talking about or looking at. But either way, let's move on to the next commentator to get put in a D tier. I think this is the last one going into D tier, and that's going to be Rashad Evans. Now, I need help with this, dude, because he's listed as being a commentator from 2017 to 2021. But I'm going to be honest, I can't actually think of a specific fight or mistake or fucking anything that Rashad Evans made on commentary. And when I try to look up clips of him commentating on YouTube so that I don't have to just scour through fights from 2017, like, oh, to 20, you know, I don't want to go watch 4 years of fights to try to hear Rashad Evans speak on commentary. I think most people, when they think of Rashad, they think of his role on the analyst desk. But even there, I always feel like he has a tough time speaking, which is probably why he didn't commentate very often and all that much, or, you know, for the length of time. And while in the referee tier list, we kind of talked about how being remembered can be a good thing because it probably means you didn't fuck up too bad. I feel like as a commentator, being remembered is probably pretty useful. When he's on the analyst desk, like I said, I felt like I feel like I'm listening to a different version or different model, I guess you could say, of Dominic Cruz, just a more soft-spoken version. He's very awkward when he'd speak, or at least that's what it comes across like. And, you know, look, dude, I'm not some totally fucking straight edge guy, and I'm not going to pretend like I've not eaten some psilocybin before, but maybe Rashad Evans just has had too much, man. That's how I feel like listening to him when he speaks on the desk. I'm like, Jesus Christ, dude, did you eat an eighth of mushrooms before we got here and you don't want to give it away, or what's happening, you know? But I don't know. I like Rashad, but you know, some guys just speak better than others. And I say that as I fumble through my words, and that's okay. But either way, I feel like if I put it like this, there's never been a moment where I've heard Rashad say something and I'm like, you know what, dude, that was really fucking insightful. That was super well spoken. I can't think of a single time that has ever happened. And I'm not trying to be shitty. Like I said, I like Rashad Evans, but when we're talking about commentary, these are the things I gotta judge, okay? Now let us move on to C tier. And I have a feeling that at least 3 of the 4 guys going into this row are going to drive people crazy, because they're either going to think that they should be way lower on the list or they should be way higher on the list. But this, you know, listen, dude, it is what it is. First commentator to go into C tier is going to be Michael Bisping, okay? Now, listen, there are things I like about Bisping's commentary that I will point out to contrast the negativity. I appreciate that Michael Bisping isn't stuck on this old method of scoring, at least not all of the time. That's not existed for a very long time. Okay, he will point out when commentators start getting excited over takedowns and things like that, that in order for it to matter or for it to win a round, the fighter in question is going to have to do something with it, and that he can't just take a guy down and do nothing with it. He's also very critical of guys that are coasting and things like that, which I do appreciate. And I do not understand how so many commentators are just stuck in like 2015. They see a takedown, like Dominic Cruz, by the way, unless it's Habib over Conor, I guess, because, you know, I don't know. But, well, that could steal him the round. Like, it's the old Benson Henderson shit. Like, you get a takedown in the last minute to try and secure a round or some shit. Like, this is not existed for a very long time, okay? But either way, Bisping does have his flaws as a commentator. First of all, the guy is always slurping. And I think it's just because, I don't know, bro's got a PhD in Japanese. He talks so much that his spit starts falling out. So he goes like mid-essay, you'll just hear him go like that. It's weird. Another thing is that he talks so much that it feels like other commentators don't get a chance to say anything when he's there. And oftentimes it's just Michael Bisping saying the same thing 3 or 4 fucking times in a row with different words. It's so strange. It's not even like a flex, like I know all these synonyms. It'll literally be like, he's undefeated. He's 8-0. He's never lost a fight. Like, you just said that. What are you doing? We know, bro, when you say he's undefeated, we know he's never lost, okay? Why do you have to say it like that? That's what he does all the time. And then he'll just be slurping through it too. You know, you got to be careful. You could get hit in the face. You might get punched in the jaw. You might get a black eye. Like, we get it, Bisping, dude. You could get hit in the face. Okay, relax. It's just fucking hell. Either way. And last, but certainly not least, Michael Bisping is extremely biased when he's commentating for a British guy. Almost shamelessly so. Just out in the open. He will just openly be biased towards a British fighter, which at least he's not trying to hide it or act like he's not, although I think if you ask him, he'll probably say that he's not biased. But either way, let's move on to the next commentator to get ranked into C tier, and that is going to be Brendan Fitzgerald, who oftentimes is paired up with Michael Bisping. He's all right. Obviously, he's play-by-play. I know his role's a little bit more different, supposed to be more bland and like straight edge, right? Because he's trying to get through the ad reads and things like that. And I don't necessarily have anything against him, to be fair, although sometimes I feel like you can tell he doesn't know as much about the sport as other commentators, obviously, and I get that most of them are fighters, but still, you got to make up for that knowledge, right? Read a book or fucking figure it out. I don't know, take notes. And I'm not saying he's not knowledgeable. He just seems there's times where you can tell he doesn't necessarily know what he's talking about. Although he's had some funny moments, man. I can't remember what knockout it was, but I remember Brendan Fitzgerald screaming that he needed a cigarette, and I thought that was pretty fucking funny. Either way, you know, but when I see him commentating, I'm like, you know, all right, it is what it is. I'm not mad about it. I'm not excited either. And to be fair, I don't listen to commentary a whole lot because I'm usually streaming the fights, but whatever. Let's move on. Next commentator, I almost called him a fighter, to get put into C tier, and that is going to be, I know this one's going to piss people off. Either they think he should be F or S. I think C is a fair grade. Okay? Joe Rogan. I know there's a lot of Rogan fanboys in the MMA world, but listen, like I said, people are either going to think he should be F or S. If this was like 10 years ago, I would probably put him higher up on this list. Maybe even 5 years ago, honestly. But Joe Rogan's commentary is so fucking outdated. And you know what it is? 5, 6, 7 years ago type thing, I would listen to his podcast quite a bit, but the same criticism I would give of his podcast, at least for me personally, I would give to his commentary, is that it's so fucking repetitive, dude. You think I want to hear for the 6th time this week about how there's only 1,000 comedians left and you guys are absolute fucking murderers and killers and all this? Like, no, I don't, okay? I don't want to hear it. It's, you stop glazing yourself. It's self-flagellate, whatever. Stop it, okay? You get up on a stage and you tell jokes. And honestly, your last special seemed like you might have done what Carlos Mencia did back in the day. Oh, and Brendan Schaub jokes. But either way, I get for some new fans, he's probably pretty helpful. But at this point, I don't even know, man. Because he's not kept up with a lot of shit. So he will just spread, and I hate this word, but fucking misinformation. But that's exactly what he does. If you listen to Joe Rogan judge or, argue certain scoring decisions that are widely, not wildly, regarded as robberies, you would probably think that the last 2 rounds count more than the first fucking 3, which is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. One of the dumbest things you would for sure know, though, if you've listened to his commentary, that Benson Henderson basically invented the calf kick. He is Albert Einstein of the calf kick. And that they've changed the game, man. People forget, man. Benson Henderson, you would also think that a fight should be had on a basketball court, and that nobody should be able to intervene in the fight if you're just going to lay on top of the guy and not fight, But when Joe Rogan is commentating, look, like I said earlier, usually I'm streaming, so I'm not necessarily listening to commentary, but I will mute it at this point. It's gotten to the point where I'm like, I don't want to fucking hear you talk about it, okay? I understand that you know about Pedro Hizzo. Yes, Benson Henderson was one of the first dudes in the UFC to be using the calf kick effectively. I get all that shit, dude, but I've heard it 100 times in the last 6 months, okay? Also, Joe Rogan is biased. And there's going to be people who know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not going to get into it, but we know who he's biased towards. He is extremely biased. I'll be a bit more vague and broad with it. Fighters that he has had on his podcast that he's got somewhat of like a relationship or a friendship with, he will be biased towards. Or if he likes their fight style, he'll be biased towards. It's just, listen, man, it's annoying. Like I said, 6 to 10 years ago, I'd rank him a lot higher. But honestly, every year, he's just going to move lower and lower on this list for me because I'm just getting sick of the same talking points over and over and over again. And one last thing I'll just point out. This isn't even necessarily to do with his commentary, but it kind of is because it will get brought up sometimes. He constantly makes excuses for known steroid cheats like John Jones, despite the fact that if you do watch his podcast, you probably know Derek for More Plates, More Dates. Has given him extremely detailed breakdowns of how that whole pulsing picogram bullshit is just that bullshit. And, but Joe Rogan just conveniently forgets that entire episode exists, I guess, whenever he has to talk about fighters like that. Either way, moving on. That sounded like I'm being a real Joe Rogan hater, and I don't hate Joe Rogan, but I swear, dude, his commentary gets very frustrating to me. Let's move on. The next commentator to get put on this tier list going into C tier is going to be Daniel Cormier. Now, I understand a lot of people think DC is not a good commentator. I actually don't dislike him or his commentary as much as a lot of other people do. I'll see large swaths of the fan base jumping on any criticism of DC, even if it comes from a salty Renat Fakhretdinov, because DC rightly called out that he was gifted a robbery decision by a judge named fucking like Wahami Ali Muhammad or some shit, and even though Renat Fakhretdinov is completely wrong in that scenario, just because he's calling out DC, you'll have a bunch of people pretend that he was correct. But the issue, you guys all know one of the issues with him is that he doesn't do his own research. I don't even see this as much of an issue. I could honestly put DC up higher. I just think that there's guys that are better than him currently and even in the past. He's just outsourcing, man. Like, how much time do you think this motherfucker has in his day? You want him to go and watch these random dudes that have just got one fight on the Contender Series, and like, it's just, he's outsourcing. He's being time and business efficient. Okay, so maybe sometimes I think a more legitimate criticism you could have is that he doesn't review the notes that has been prepared for him. So if you're paying a guy to do all the hard research, then you should at the very least know those notes like front and back pretty damn well. Now, sometimes he might get a little bit goofy on commentary, which again, I don't necessarily mind. He does, however, have the same bias a lot of them do when it comes to scoring takedowns almost over, over almost anything. Jesus. So, I mean, as far as most color commentators go, I don't think he's as bad as some of them. I know people are going to think it's blasphemy that Bisping is lower than DC or in the same tier as DC, but still. Or even, I hear people acting like Dominic Cruz is better than DC. And this is another one, like the Renat Fakhretdinov situation. Dominic Cruz calls out Daniel Cormier for not doing his own research. And fans jump on it immediately just because they don't like DC. But Dominic Cruz is implying there, it's presupposed that he does all his own research. But you know what, dude? He still fucking sucks. So, I don't know. All right, now let's get into B tier. Now, the first commentator to go into the B tier category is going to be Jimmy Smith. And I think it's really too bad that Jimmy Smith didn't get more time with the UFC. I thought he was such a good commentator, and his talents were being completely wasted at Bellator. He was only with the UFC for, I think, less than a year, but I thought he did a great job. I remember fights he commentated, despite him only being around for a very short time, kind of like what I was talking about with Rashad Evans, where, I can't think of a moment of him on commentary. With Jimmy Smith, I can think of one off the top of my head. In Robert Whitaker versus Yoel Romero 2, there was a clean head kick landed by Rob, and in between rounds, Jimmy Smith had them re-roll it with sound, and he said that it sounded like a home run, and it did. It sounded exactly like a home run being hit with a wooden bat, which, it was a cool moment, and I remember it, and I've always remembered it, and that was years ago. He was clearly very passionate about the sport, had kept his knowledge up to date, but also had a good historical knowledge pool that he could draw from. So, kind of like what we were talking about with Joe Rogan, where his historical knowledge is very good, but he's not really kept up to date on the scoring or even newer fighters, if we're being honest. Jimmy Smith, at the time at least, was up to date with his knowledge, but like I said, still could draw from a lot of historical context and things like that. So, also, post his commentary career at the UFC, I appreciate things that he has done. When Ronda Rousey was going on the whole pity party, trying to act as though nothing is ever her fault and she was mistreated by basically every single person ever, Jimmy Smith made a few YouTube videos exposing her. I don't know how many views they got, but they were pretty interesting, and he basically just shut that shit down and exposed the fact that she's the type of chick to be rude to basically fucking everybody. So I appreciated that, and like I said, thought he was a very good commentator, and I wish that the UFC had re-signed him. But either way, dude, let's move on. Next commentator to go into B tier is going to be Dan Hardy. Now, I know there's a lot of people that don't like Dan Hardy, and I don't necessarily like Dan Hardy, but I think his commentary was pretty good. I do have criticisms of him I could levy, whether it's things that he says on his podcast or whatever it may be, but when we're just talking about commentary, I thought it was good. Like Jimmy Smith, obviously very passionate about the sport. Also, he was a fighter, so kind of to be expected. Sometimes it came off as a little bit extra. If I'm being honest, you would see him standing up, oftentimes at his desk and creeping in through the cage looking like a peeping Tom. He also had some very obvious moments of bias when commentating British fighters or guys that he trained with more specifically. Now, I agree with Dan on Herb Dean, but not for the reasons that Dan Hardy, thinks what he thinks of Herb Dean. And when I think about whether or not I agree with someone or that I align with them on an issue, I try to think of how they got to that position. Now, Dan Hardy's initial criticism of Herb started for most part due to his stoppage of Jai Herbert versus Francisco Trinaldo, which eventually led to Dan Hardy losing his job. I'll get to that in a second. I don't think the stoppage was that bad, but Dan was friends and teammates with Jai Herbert, which is probably why he was so angry. So he arrived at his position because of bias, in my opinion. But then he was able to go back on his YouTube channel and prove his case pretty solidly, in my opinion, that Herb Dean had in fact been slipping. He had brought up a bunch of examples of him making late stoppages and things like that. Now, but you know, I've said in the past that Dan Hardy got fired because of the Herb situation. Then I have people that immediately correct me and say, well, no, it was because he threatened or a female employee or something like that. But the details that were given by the UFC were always very vague. And Dan Hardy refutes them. So it's basically just, who do you believe? And it happened immediately after the Herb Dean situation. So if somebody knows where I can find a more detailed account of that, please let me know down in the comments below, because I feel like Dan Hardy himself has been fairly vague on the whole issue as well. Maybe he doesn't want to fuck over Veronica's career or something. I don't know, but you know, I don't know if Dan Hardy's commentary is as good as it was now that he's in the PFL, but based off his time at the UFC, I thought he was very passionate. He was very knowledgeable. In his career, he was for the most part a striker, so I enjoyed that he doesn't glaze wrestling and control time the way that some of these other ex-fighters do. But either way, let's move on. The next commentator to get put into B tier is going to be Randy Couture. I think Randy's just an underrated and underappreciated commentator. Obviously, he's a fucking legend, and most people remember him as such, but as far as fighters go, I actually enjoyed his commentary quite a bit. He didn't get a whole lot of time because of the issues that he had with the UFC, of course, but he was pretty well spoken, and like I said, a fucking legend. So, you know, I just think he's a little bit underrated in that regard, and he didn't get to do it for that long. I think he's commentated in other organizations as well, if I'm not mistaken, but I am trying to judge just UFC commentary. Either way, let's move on to the next commentator to get put into B tier, and that is going to be Frank Mir. Kind of like Randy Couture, I think he's a little bit underrated, underappreciated. He did have experience commentating for other organizations, I think before and after the UFC actually, but Frank Mir is one of those fighters that I enjoy listening to him on podcasts and all the rest of it. He's very well spoken. He would bring up relevant points. He was knowledgeable in all aspects of MMA, obviously being a fighter and especially grappling. So I thought he did a good job for the time that he was there. I believe he was only with the UFC commentating for about 4 years, but I think he did a lot of commentary in other organizations. Either way, let's get to A tier now, okay? I know this category is going to irritate some people. Not all of the decisions will, but some will. The first commentator to get put into A tier is going to be Paul Felder. And I'm going to be honest, I did this hesitantly, okay? Very hesitantly. I really tried to balance out criticisms with praise, or tried to not focus on nitpicks too heavily, because I do have a nitpick of Paul Felder, but then I tried to just ignore that a little bit and judge his commentary overall rather than letting that cloud my judgment. Okay, Paul Felder, what he does that drives me crazy is he thinks he's funny when he's not. The whole nutshot counter shtick made me so fucking angry. And to be fair, probably to an unhealthy degree. And also, to be fair, I think he's gotten off of that. I don't think he does it anymore. So maybe one of his commentary partners or maybe the UFC was like, bro, can you stop? Like, it's not that funny. You don't need to keep a fucking tally of every time a nutshot happens. It was one time he did it, and I think he just thought it was the funniest thing ever, so he started doing it from then on out. But either way. Then I tried to come up with good things I could say, so I wasn't unfairly ranking him, and I think that Paul Felder's probably the best fighter commentator that is current, at the very least. He doesn't speak to the point where he's stepping on toes, kind of like Michael Bisping. I think he understands balance in that regard. He lets people get their points out and things like that. He understands scoring pretty damn well, but isn't insanely biased towards striking, despite that being how he likes to fight, whereas we'll see guys like Daniel Cormier, Dominic Cruz, guys like this heavily favor the the aspect of mixed martial arts that they excelled in. Paul doesn't necessarily do that. I liked him being paired with certain commentators over others, but I actually think that he pairs well with almost everybody, and I think it goes to him not speaking too much, knowing when not to step on toes and things like that. So, like I said, out of this current batch of color commentators, I actually think he might be the best one, at least the former fighters. When he's on commentary with Dom Cruz, he sounds like a genius. When he's on commentary with Bisping, I'm thinking, oh my god, I wish Bisping spoke as much as Paul Felder did. And when he goes well with DC as well. So, aside from that little nitpick I brought up at the beginning, I think that his pros strongly outweigh the cons in terms of his commentary. So, yeah, I think Paul Felder is the best color commentator right now. Moving on, I know this one's going to drive people crazy. The next commentator to get put into A tier is going to be Jon Anik. Okay. I know a lot of people don't like Jon Anik. Just listen, dude. So kind of like Paul Felder, there are definitely nitpicks I could make of Jon Anik. But if I make, like I said, a pros and a cons list, I don't think that the nitpicks I would have outweigh his overall performance as a commentator. I think that Jon Anik is the best play-by-play commentator the UFC has ever had. I know the memes with the child custody shit, which, by the way, obviously, both of those guys spoke about it in their fighter interviews, and while it was a very awkward moment, I think his intentions were good, and I'll tell you why. So, Jon Anik on his own podcast has been very outspoken about men who get fucked over by vindictive ex-wives or baby mamas or whatever when it comes to their children. Okay, not that he's not advocating for people to be like deadbeats or not pay child support or things like that, but literally just when it comes to the amount of time guys get with their children after they've separated from the mother. He has a couple friends who, he's explained this on his podcast, he's had a couple friends who have gone through this issue, and like I said, he's been very outspoken about it. So I don't think he was trying to be malicious in any way, shape, or form. I think it was something that probably got brought up at fighter meetings, and he thought he could somehow work it in, but then maybe realized once he started that he probably shouldn't go off on a tangent like that. Maybe he would get in trouble, or who knows, you know. It came off very awkward, but like I said, I think his intentions were, for the most part, pure. There was also one moment where he called MMA fans the lowest common denominator, which was very annoying. I made a video shitting on him for that because it's untrue. Listen, there are shit fans in every fucking sport, but to act like MMA is uniquely horrible when you have soccer teams rioting, starting fires, when you have hockey teams rioting, looting, starting fires. Okay, Vancouver, I'm talking to you directly, you fucking idiots. And I'm fucking from there. You know, how are you going to act like MMA fans are worse? I've never seen an MMA fan throw a banana at a fucking a fighter, okay? So, you know, either way. Now, sometimes I'll have, you know, issues or like disagreements with how he scores a fight or commentates on a fight or something like that. But unlike a lot of these commentators, he has actually read the rules and the scoring criteria, and I think that he at the very least makes a good faith attempt to apply them, or at the very least how he interprets it. So you can argue that he's wrong, but I don't think you can argue that he's ignorant in that regard. A good example of this would be Jose Aldo versus Mario Bautista. He thought that Mario Bautista was the winner. Me, along with a shitload of fans, thought otherwise, obviously, but he's not doing it to try to, like, you know, big up Mario Bautista or downplay Jose Aldo. Mario Bautista is not some like fucking superstar. You know what I mean? So he's not shilling for the UFC in that regard. And I've heard Anik call out robberies when he thinks there is one. A good example of this would be Petr Yan versus Aljamain Sterling, the second fight. Jon Anik is really good friends with Ray Longo and Aljamain Sterling and these guys, right? And he said that he thought Petr Yan won that fight. So just it's gone both ways for me, but I don't think that he's ever doing it, you know, kind of like maliciously or just trying to shill or whatever. Lastly, though, this is one of the reasons I've got him so high up here. He is objectively speaking the gold standard when it comes to fighter pronunciation. He might be the only one that takes that portion of his job as seriously as he does. So every commentator, Jon Anik has explained this on his podcast as well, get audio files of the fighter saying their own names, saying it normally, saying it slowed down or like broken up by syllable, and then saying it, so they get it normal speed, slowed speed, and syllable. And Jon Anik, I think, might be the only one that actually studies it relentlessly. If you ever have a question of how to say a fighter's name or something like that, try and find him saying it, and that is correct fucking 95% of the time, you know. And I've seen people try to argue with him, and he says, well, that's how they say it. And who are you to question Luke fucking Thomas trying to tell me how to say Alex Caceres' name when he says Alex Caceres? Okay, so that's that. Either way, I think Jon Anik's fantastic, very professional. So he's had some corny moments here and there. You know, I think maybe he tries to force some of those cool little one-liners that he has, but there's also been some that do sound very cool, at least in my opinion. Either way, moving on. Next commentator to get put into A tier is going to be Ken Flo. I miss Kenny Florian, man. I actually miss him quite a bit on commentary. I think he's quite a bit better than a lot of the commentators today. Um, I think he was such a good commentator actually because of experience that he had before that. For those of you that don't know, and maybe I'm just aging myself a little bit here, Kenny Florian used to, and actually he might still commentate BattleBots, which is cool as fuck. I used to watch that as a kid. Around the same age I got into UFC as well. I might have been a bit younger for BattleBots. I was about 10 the first time I watched a UFC fight, so maybe it was a little bit before that, but those parts of my childhood definitely overlapped. Kenny Florian alongside Anik had very good chemistry as well, which makes sense. Obviously, they're good friends. They have a podcast together now and all the rest of it. I think the UFC should have kept Kenny Florian on. He's gotten jobs after the fact, commentating in other organizations and things like that, but I just think it's talent wasted. Nobody's going to fucking hear you when you're at the PFL, okay? It's just true. He provides good insight in most disciplines, and obviously loves the sport very, very much. Very good grappler and all the rest of it. So I think Kenny Florian used to do a fantastic job. Moving on to the last one. I know this one's going to ruffle some feathers, okay? A-tier commentator is Laura Sanko. I can hear the simp comments now, which it's just not true, okay? Listen, I'm not going to berate you if you think that her pitch or her shrillness doesn't quite bode well with other commentators. But in my opinion, she puts in more effort than basically every commentator on this fucking list. She studies every fighter, knows all their old fights, took a judging course to know how to actually score rounds, unlike basically every other commentator. So you'll hear Michael Bisping or Paul Felder or whoever, and I praised them for it earlier, but this is, now I'll nitpick a little bit. When they talk about scoring and how you need to do something with a takedown, sometimes the verbiage is incorrect and like the concept is correct, but the verbiage is incorrect. So Michael Bisping will bring up damage. If you read the scoring criteria, it doesn't fucking say damage. Okay, it just doesn't. It says impact, which then it defines impact, and impact defined in the scoring criteria basically is damage. It's like a synonym, okay? But it doesn't say damage. But Michael Bisping will act like it does. Laura Sanko knows word for word the scoring criteria, and I don't think other ones do. And like I said, she took a judging course, so she knows at the very least how to apply the scoring criteria. And look, I've had moments where her voice, I'm like, oh, a little bit much. And it's funny because I wrote this list before this past Saturday, where when Wang Kong got choked out, Laura Sanko fucking like growled a moan, and I was like, okay, really? Was that necessary? But I didn't want to go move her down just because of that one moment. But another moment I can think of is when Israel Adesanya, which by the way, I thought overall she did a good job in this fight. She was one of the first commentators to start big up in Sean Strickland in this fight and acting like he was winning, because he was. She said something like, Sean Strickland just fighting like a man. And I was like, oh my God, what the fuck? But, still, either way. But like I said, I've had moments where her voice is just a little bit much. And it's not just because I hate women. Okay, it's not just because of that. No, I'm just kidding. I've got a wife. Okay, relax. This is a random story, but I listened to a Luke Thomas super chatter, which, by the way, if you're giving that dude money, you're probably closer aligned with him than not when it comes to social or political views. And this poor chatter tried to explain with a ton of nuance as to why, even though he thinks on merit, she is probably the best commentator that they have, but her pitch mixed with the likes of Bisping or, John Anik or whoever it is, not John Anik, I guess, but whoever it is, right? Sometimes it just doesn't mix well. And that particular chatter didn't seem to have an issue when it was like Misha Tate or something like that, but he really thinks it's because Laura Sanko's got a higher pitch voice than some other women that have commentated in the past, not even for the UFC, but just in general, right? And Luke Thomas went on a 15-minute rant about how this guy's sexist, and I was like, what the fuck is wrong with you, dude? So I'm not going to do that. If you don't like her voice with the guys on commentary, that's fair enough. But if we were to run her voice through a voice changer to be a man or to have like a deeper women's voice, even just so she wasn't so shrill sounding. You know, I think that I don't know that anybody could argue she's a bad commentator at all. It's just, you couldn't, because she puts in more effort than any of these guys. She knows what she's talking about. She studies like crazy. So, you know, if you have a hard time hearing her voice, that's fine. But imagine her commentary with a different voice, and then you try and fucking tell me that she's bad at her job, okay? Because she's not. You can't argue it, period. And a lot of these other commentators, I don't think, do the best job. I would rather listen to Laura Senko than I would Dominic Cruz, okay? Either way, let's move on. F tier. This is gonna piss a lot of people off, and I am excited for it, but I also don't care. The commentator that is going into F tier, and this is objectively correct, is Mike Goldberg. Mike Goldberg fucking sucks, and he always sucked, okay? The only reason anybody thinks Mike Goldberg is good is because of nostalgia. What is his stupid shit? You know, just the catchphrases. I can't even think of them off the top of my head because I've never liked them. But here we go. Or virtually identical. Dude, he would say virtually identical when it literally wasn't. I don't understand. I've heard him compare Anthony Pettis to Chris Avila in fucking Bellator because they're both 5'11" and white. What are we talking about here? This guy doesn't know what he's talking about fucking ever. Okay? And it makes no sense. He started commentary in 1997. He's been doing this for almost 30 years, and you still suck. How do you not know more when you've been... There is no... When would that ever happen? You've been doing a job for 30 fucking years, and you still say dumb shit like Chris Avila reminds you of Anthony fucking Pettis. I don't get it. Okay, I just don't. He doesn't know what he's talking about ever. Do you understand? He just doesn't. I don't even know how you could argue anyways. Or whatever. Argue. Yeah, whatever. I don't even know what I was trying to say. I don't know how you could argue that he knows what he's talking about is what I was trying to say, but it came out fucked up. It doesn't matter. You can't tell me Mike Goldberg knows what he's looking at or what he's talking about. Period. You just can't. There were so many times he said shit that was just didn't make any sense at all. And I get it, dude. It is all over. You know, good for him. Okay? He once said that Travis Lutter was the Michael Jordan of grappling. Shut the fuck up, dude. Joe Rogan called him out for that, thank God. You could literally go on forever about dumb shit that he has said, okay? He says it's just ridiculous. I don't know how anybody likes this guy ever. It's all nostalgia. That's the only reason anybody likes Mike Goldberg. Is for nostalgia. Point blank, period. You cannot convince me otherwise. Doesn't know what he's looking at. Doesn't know what he's talking about. And just says corny catchphrases. That was like his whole thing. He was trying to be like, I don't know. Fucking Jesus, dude. I don't want to start. Listen, we'll move on. S tier commentator, in my opinion, Brian Stan. Okay? Listen, like every other commentator on this list, I do have like little nitpicks, but it's so minor that I just don't give a fuck. So Brian Stan does this one thing where he tries to use these like fancy synonyms for something looking good, and it ends up being a bit much. Like, he'll talk about a guy digging for underhooks, and he's like, oh my god, he dug for those underhooks absolutely gorgeously. And it's like, okay, dude, relax, you know? Relax, okay? Because what that word's gonna... listen, maybe he's just very passionate about the sport, which very clearly he is, obviously. And I don't have a problem with those words inherently, but when you describe something like digging for underhooks as gorgeous, the word loses its value. Do you understand? If something actually spectacular happens, like a head kick, now what are you gonna say? When you just described underhooks as gorgeous, and then you describe a head kick, do you know what I mean? So, but other than that, I can't think of a single time where I was like, oh my god, shut the fuck up. I can't think of any really bad mistakes he's made. He was super enthusiastic, a good post-fight interviewer, and I've not heard, I don't think, a single person ever say anything bad about Brian Stan. Not a single fucking person, dude. I'm not even American, and he makes me proud, okay, of America. So Brian Stan is the shit, and the only reason he stopped commentating was because he's such a good dude. He wanted to spend more time with his family. So I mean, how can you hate on that? You know, please, I would actually, if anybody can think of a time that Brian Stan fucked up on commentary or said something really stupid, please let me know down in the comments below, because I racked my brain and I couldn't think of a single thing other than the nitpick that I pointed out. Just him saying words like gorgeous or beautiful or whatever, just a little bit too much for things that, you know, are okay, basically. But that's about it. I mean, he was one of my favorite commentators, or he was my favorite commentator at the time. There's times where I'm like, fuck, I wish they would bring Brian Stan back, or I wish he was still a commentator or whatever, especially in comparison to some of these newer color commentators that were former fighters as well. But yeah, man, I think Brian Stan's the shit at commentary. Either way, dude, that's it for this tier list. Okay, like and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it. I will see you at the next video. Bye bye.